Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The last bread of winter. I remember a winter when the wind seemed older than all of us combined. It slipped through the cracks in the roof like a persistent whisper, making the wooden beams groan as if the house itself felt hunger. At that time, I was just one of the younger children, too small to carry firewood, but already old enough to notice how our parents avoided our eyes during dinner. We lived in a clay and stone cabin on the edge of a clearing where the sun left early, and time seemed to freeze between day and night, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. Firewood had become scarce, and the potatoes had vanished weeks before. The scent that still lingered in the kitchen was that of a cold oven, an aroma made of memory and ash. In the center of the rough wooden table, wrapped in a cloth once embroidered by my grandmother, rested what we called the last bread of winter. It wasn't large, nor beautiful, but it seemed as precious as gold beneath the flickering lamplight. No one dared to touch it. It had been there for 2 days, untouched, like a silent pact among us all. In that modest home, where the cold slept in the corners and dreams turned in early, we learned more from silence than from words. My father, a man of few words and hands as large as wooden shovels, would spend long hours looking out the window, watching the field covered in a hard crust of snow, as if the very earth had fallen asleep. My mother, who once hummed tunes while stirring soup, now only smoothed her apron with repetitive gestures, her eyes fixed on the bread. None of us asked when the next meal would be. We learned early that hunger, too, goes quiet. One night, the youngest among us, his eyes still full of the innocence of those who believe the world is fair, asked if we could share the bread. A silence so deep followed that even the wind seemed to wait. My mother smiled, one of those smiles that hurt more than hunger, and said that he still needed to grow, and for that, the bread was his. My father nodded with his eyes, and that was enough. The boy looked at the bread, then at all of us, and said he would only eat if everyone had a piece too. And that's how the sharing began, not by the decision of the elders, but by the brave little heart of the youngest. I remember clearly the sound of the cloth unfolding as if it were part of a sacred rite. My fingers touched the warm, rough crust of the bread with silent reverence, like someone holding a promise. It was a dark, dense bread, made with what was left of flour and patience. Each slice cut with the dull knife seemed to shave off a little of the hope we had stored in the corners of the house. And yet, something sweet hovered in the air, a kind of relief, as if the simple act of sharing made us stronger than the cold creaking outside. As we chewed in silence, our eyes met with a tenderness that words couldn't reach. Our stomachs still complained, it's true, but something else was being nourished there. Care. I remember how my older brother pretended to choke on a tiny piece just to make the youngest laugh, and how that muffled laughter echoed like a stray ray of sunlight through the clouds. Even in that scarcity, there was beauty, and in that beauty, there was something more enduring than bread. There was affection. That night, no one complained. We slept together near the cold fireplace, huddled like pups, wrapped in heavy blankets that smelled of dry hay and ancient smoke. The warmth came more from our bodies than the embers, and my mother, as she used to do when we were smaller, ran her fingers through our hair before lying down. She whispered a prayer I could barely hear, something about deep roots and springs that always return. Her tone was one of someone speaking to the earth, not the sky, as if she knew it was the ground that held our hopes. The days that followed brought the same white monotony, the same frozen silence, broken only by the crows' harsh cries over the fields. But something had subtly changed within us. We ate less, yes, but we smiled more. The bread was gone, And still, it felt like we had more than before. My siblings invented games with pebbles and jar lids, and my older sister began to sing again, softly, almost as if asking sadness for permission. And when my father began collecting clean snow to melt with dried leaves, he did so while whistling, for the first time in weeks. One afternoon, when the sky seemed less heavy and the clouds thinner, my father returned from the forest with something in his arms. It wasn't firewood or game, but a bundle of dry branches covered in moss, and among them, timid nettle sprouts. "The frost is breaking," he said, with a light in his eyes we hadn't seen since autumn. That alone made us feel lighter. The nettle turned into thin soup, but steaming, and its green, earthy scent filled the house like a celebration. The bread, long gone, was remembered with fondness and gratitude, as if it had lasted far longer than its size should have allowed. That night, after the soup, my mother pulled from the bottom of a chest a candle saved for special occasions. She lit it with a damp match that took a while to catch. The small flame lit our faces with a golden glow, as if announcing to the house that the wait was almost over. We didn't speak of harvests or abundance. It was still too soon. But we spoke of hope, and that was new. I remember the smell of melting wax, the gentle dance of the flame, and the strange feeling that even though it was still winter, something in us had already begun to bloom. As days passed, the snow began to retreat shyly, revealing traces of the earth we hadn't seen in months. The bare branches of the trees shimmered differently in the morning sun, and the birds, still timid, resumed their songs among the dry canopies. My mother would say that nature, like us, needed time to wake up, and we, in our quiet and humble home, were waking with it, not in a rush, but with the same tender slowness with which one opens their eyes after a long dream. I remember one morning when my older brother found a handful of fine roots near the old well. He ran to the kitchen as if he'd found a treasure, and in a way, he had. Cooked with a pinch of salt, they released an earthy aroma that made our mouths water as if we were about to feast. We sat at the table as always, without many words, but with full hearts. And for the first time since that winter began, we ate without fear of tomorrow. The last bread was now only a memory, but the lesson it left, of sacrifice, tenderness, and hope, remained with us, served each day in invisible portions. That year, spring arrived like a long-awaited guest who still manages to surprise you. One day, the fields were grey and cold. The next, tiny flowers were sprouting between the stones, and the stream, which had spent months hidden beneath ice, began to sing again, flowing freely among the roots. Clothes on the line swayed more lightly, and my mother began hanging fresh herbs by the windows again, just like she used to in times of plenty. The house, which for so long had smelled of cold and silence, now smelled of damp earth, green garlic, and fresh bread. It was no longer the last bread of winter, but the first of the new season, baked with the wheat my mother had secretly saved. A tiny handful she chose not to grind in the days of hunger. She had hidden it, guarding it like one protects a seed of hope, even when everything around seemed to fade. And when the new bread came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, no one cried. We simply smiled, small smiles, discreet as the first flowers of the field. We broke the bread between us with gentle hands, like those who bless a miracle, and each piece carried the serene taste of a wait fulfilled. That morning when we tasted the new bread, I remember my father holding the lightest piece, studying it for a long while before taking a bite. He said nothing, but his eyes said everything. They spoke of the fear he had hidden, of the nights he had pretended not to be hungry so we could eat, and of the silent gratitude now warming his chest. The bread dissolved slowly in his mouth, as if time itself was chewing alongside him, and for a moment no one dared to speak. It was as if that moment was sacred, a prayer without words. That very same day, my youngest brother, the same one who had once asked to share the last bread, ran to the doorway and shouted, "The green is back!" We followed him, one by one, as if his words were ropes, pulling our feet forward. Outside, the world looked new. The once pale field now shimmered with shades of life, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers growing in forgotten corners. We breathed deeply, together, and felt that we had overcome, not just the winter, but fear, scarcity, and silence. And there, beneath the clear sky, we silently promised ourselves never to forget the taste of that last bread. The days that followed felt like pages turned with care, each one bringing small, everyday miracles. A hen that began laying eggs again, an old neighbor who appeared with a basket of onions, the return of the village market with its familiar sense of cheese, leather, and exaggerated stories. We walked with lighter steps, not because the path was shorter, but because our hearts were less heavy. There were still challenges, yes, but now we knew we could face them, together as we had always been. Sometimes, when night fell and the hearth crackled gently, my mother would whisper old stories, as if stitching the walls of our home with words of tenderness. And among those stories, we always returned to that winter. Not as a lament, but like someone gently caressing a scar they wear with pride. The last bread had become a living memory, a symbol of all we had learned about generosity, care, and the quiet strength of those who love. And even today, so many years later, when the cold returns and the earth sleeps, there is always a simple loaf on our table, not out of need, but remembrance. And so every time winter returns to blow its promises of silence and retreat, we light the oven with a bit more solemnity. It is not the same bread, it couldn't be, but the gesture that remains intact. We cut the first slice with calm hands, share it with whoever is near, and let the aroma fill the rooms like an ancient lullaby. The last bread of winter is no longer with us, but its memory stays warm and alive, like the flame that insists on crackling even when everything around it seems to sleep. And perhaps in the end, that is what keeps a home standing, the stories that nourish us long after the bread is gone. The wall that never ended. I remember clearly the muffled sound of my boots on damp soil at the break of dawn. In those days, the abbey bells rang before the mist had even lifted from the twisted branches of the willows. I was already a man with calloused hands and a bent back when I accepted, more with resignation than enthusiasm, the task of building the monastery wall. A wall too long to be fair, too tall to be ignored. The monks said it would be a sacred shield against the evils of the world, but to me it seemed only an endless line to be filled with stones and silence. The stones came from a distant hillside, hauled in creaking carts drawn by patient oxen. Each block had its own weight, its own stubbornness. Some settled in place easily, as if they had waited centuries to rest in that exact spot. Others, however, resisted the touch of the chisel, defying my hand with every blow. As I stacked stone upon stone, sermons echoed from the chapel windows, gentle words about penance, virtue, and renunciation. I heard it all, the abbot's voice, the whispered prayers, even the novices' hushed chatter. But no one ever asked what I thought. And over time, I must admit, I began to wonder if that even mattered. There was a certain comfort in repetition. The days followed a predictable rhythm. The pale sun rising over the fields, the steady clink of chisel on stone, the monotonous chants floating through the air like golden dust. At times, as I bent down to pick up another rock, I caught the sweet scent of herbs growing behind the monastery, marjoram, hyssop, lavender. Other times, the breeze carried the aroma of freshly baked bread from the kitchen. All of it tethered me to a quiet kind of peace, as if the world were an old clock and I just a small but necessary gear within it. One morning, however, as I lined up a row of stones under the misty autumn sky, I noticed something I never had before. The wall didn't curve. It didn't end at any corner. It simply stretched onward, straight and unchanging, as if it meant to reach the horizon. or encircle the whole world. A troubling thought passed through me like a sudden gust of wind. Where does it go? Was it really a wall of protection? Or perhaps containment? What if it wasn't guarding the abbey from external threats, but keeping something or someone locked within? That day my work slowed. My eyes kept returning to the wall's line, trying to decipher its purpose. The monks walked past me as they always had, some in haste, others with downcast eyes and quiet steps, as if afraid to wake something sleeping beneath the earth. One of them, Brother Clement, paused briefly. He handed me a pitcher of water and said, with a weary smile, "Stones here more than one might think." Then he went on, as if he'd said nothing unusual. I stood there for a while, holding the pitcher, listening only to the rustling of dry leaves and the distant chime of the sext bell. I began to notice more. The abbey's sounds, once so routine, began to carry nuances I'd never caught before. Muffled laughter behind the garden, solitary weeping from the cloister at night, and once, I swear on my soul, I heard 3 slow knocks on the inner side of the wall when no one else was around. Deep knocks, like someone testing whether there were still ears on the other side. I'd thought about asking the abbot about the wall's true purpose, but how could a simple mason dare question the will of holy men? Still, the doubt grew like moss between the cracks in the stone. I began to realize the wall wasn't just growing. It was winding, crawling, gently curving across the land, skirting small rises, avoiding the forest, as if following a logic of its own, invisible to human eyes. When I asked the youngest novice if there was a plan for its path, he only shrugged and muttered, "It's always been like this, since before my time." That struck me as strange, since before his time. But who, then, had begun it all? On certain nights, when work stretched past vespers, I lingered there under the golden glow of the candles the monks left in their windows. By moonlight, the wall took on an almost human expression. Its stones seemed to breathe, its outline cast flickering shadows like veils. In those moments, I often felt a presence beside me, nothing threatening, just the sense that someone, silently, laid an invisible hand on my shoulder as if to say, "Keep going, you're almost there." But I knew there was still a long way to go. Once, at the height of summer, a group of pilgrims passed through the abbey. People from afar, on their way to the sanctuary of St. William. One of them, an old man with a slow gait and deep gaze, stopped before the wall, scratched his thin beard and said, "Strange place to raise a boundary. This doesn't seem to keep anyone out. It feels like it's keeping something in." The monks hurried him along, saying he was tired and delirious from the heat. But his words stayed with me, like a stone forgotten in the bottom of my apron. That night I whispered them to myself, like an inverted prayer. The days grew quieter after that. Perhaps it was just my mind, or perhaps the monks too sensed something shifting. The prayers grew longer. The bells rang with uncertain intervals. Even the birds that once perched atop the wall now seemed to avoid that dusty line of stones. And still, day after day, I kept working, not out of obedience nor blind faith, but because somehow that wall had become part of me. As if each stone bore not just the weight of granite, but also fragments of my own soul. It was on a morning thick with fog, when silence muffled even my thoughts, that I noticed something odd. The wall I had built in a straight line for so long now made a subtle turn, almost imperceptible but real. I followed its path with my eyes, and with a shiver realized it was curving back on itself, like a serpent preparing to bite its own tail. An uneasy feeling settled in my chest, as if I had unknowingly been sealing a circle around something no one, not even the monks, dared to name. I began to dream of the wall. Simple dreams but unsettling. I would walk along it endlessly, never finding its end. I would hear voices coming from within the stones, and once, in a particularly strange night, I dreamed the wall called me by name. When I told Brother Clement, he simply gave a melancholic smile and said, "Sometimes what we build to protect us ends up knowing us better than we know ourselves." From then on, I looked at each stone not as an inert block, but as a witness, one that listened, felt, and perhaps remembered. In time, I came to see that the wall told stories too, stories no one realized they were telling. As I laid it near the kitchen, I overheard the baker monk confessing his fears about death. Near the garden, I heard two nuns exchanging secrets about a love that never should have existed, and by the cloister, one night, the abbot, in a voice barely louder than the wind's whisper, murmured a prayer for forgiveness over something I never understood. I was the invisible guardian of all those fragments, the one who listened without being seen, and somehow that made me feel less alone. I came to see the wall not as a prison or barrier, but as a silent book. Each stone held words that would never be written. Each curve told a secret that could only be heard in the rhythm between chisel and stillness. I no longer worried about the wall's final purpose. I understood that as I built it, it was shaping me too. My arms had grown weaker, my hair thinner, but there was a quiet peace in being part of something that needed no explanation. Meaning, I discovered, didn't lie in the end, but in the act of continuing. Years passed like that, and the wall grew with the turning of the seasons. I watched leaves fall onto its stones and moss sprout between the cracks, as if nature itself wished to soften what man had raised. Novice children who once watched me in silence now became grown monks, and I, always in the same place, saw time slip through my fingers like fine sand. Sometimes, when the setting sun cast a golden hue upon the stones, I would sit atop a pile of rubble and gaze through the still, open gaps. Life carried on, indifferent to whatever it was we were enclosing or perhaps releasing. Until one day, something curious happened. One of the stones, as I fitted it into place, made a hollow sound, different from all the others. I crouched down, tapped it lightly with my hammer, and realized that beneath that patch of earth was a cavity. It wasn't large nor deep, but inside it was an object wrapped in thick, brittle cloth. I carefully unfolded the fabric and found a small book, its leather cover cracked and its lettering nearly faded. I turned its pages with trembling hands, and there they were, old notes, scribbled in brown ink, like thoughts cast into the wind and forgotten, simple words, doubts, confessions from another mason. He had written about the same wall, the same stones, the same doubts. His words, fragile yet vivid, spoke of sleepless nights, the echo of bells, the constant sense of building something without end. In one passage, he even wondered whether there were still monks at the abbey, or if the wall was all that remained. Perhaps we are all monks pretending to be masons, or masons pretending to have faith, he once wrote. I closed the book gently, like ending a conversation with someone both ancient and deeply familiar. And in that moment, I felt less alone in the world. I placed the book in a discreet hollow between two taller stones, well protected from rain and time, not out of fear of losing it, but because I understood it didn't fully belong to me. It was part of the wall just as I was. From that day on, I never again found another object nor any hidden chamber. But as I worked, I felt that our stories, his and mine, were stitched into the joints of the granite, like a silent song only heard by those who listen to the spaces between the sounds. After that, I never hurried again. The rhythm of the days began to feel more generous, and the stones, somehow, lighter. I started to smile to myself at times as I lined up another row, remembering fragments from the little hidden notebook or the confessions carried by the wind through the cracks. The wall still grew, yes, but it no longer oppressed me. It was like embroidering a silent tapestry, stitch by stitch, verse by verse, even without ever seeing the full design. It was enough to know I was stitching, and that someone else, in days to come, might one day find a sign there that they too were not alone. And then came winter. One of those winters that makes the wood creak in the walls, and the monks walk with their hands tucked into their sleeves. My fingers had grown slower and my back stiffer than usual, but still I walked to the wall every morning with my basket of tools and my thick wool cloak. On one of those frozen mornings, the abbot approached. It wasn't common for him to be out so early. He sat beside me without a word and simply watched the path of the wall as if searching for meaning. After a while he murmured, "Perhaps we're building something we ourselves don't yet understand." I nodded softly. Sometimes meaning comes later. That afternoon I set my chisel aside and walked along the wall, something I hadn't done in years. I passed the oldest sections, ones I had laid when my beard was still dark, and the newest, where moss had yet to take root. I touched each stone with my fingertips, feeling their textures and scars as one might greet old friends. The wall was long, yes, as long as days of waiting, as long as unspoken dreams, as long as the doubts hidden deep in one's chest. But within it there was a quiet beauty, like that of embroidery done by candlelight, whose details reveal themselves only to those who look with tenderness. I returned to my place with a lighter soul. I worked until the sun slipped behind the hill, painting the sky in that deep blue that appears only on the clearest nights. The bells rang for Compline, and a gentle peace settled over the abbey like a veil. I gathered my tools, folded my cloak with care, and before leaving looked once more at the path of the wall. It was no longer merely a barrier of stone, it was a mirror of all I had been, all I had heard, all I had silently understood. And somehow it was also a bridge between me and the silence of the world. I never knew if the wall was ever completed. One day, my arms could no longer lift the chisel, and my mornings became shorter, drawn more to the warmth of the hearth and the soft clinking of spoons in a bowl of porridge. They say another mason came after me, a quiet young man with an observant gaze. I never met him, but I like to imagine that while setting a stone, he might have felt something different beneath his fingers, perhaps heard something echoing through the wall. And maybe, just maybe, he too will one day find the little hidden book and recognize himself in its pages, as I once did. Today, from the heights of my memory, I see that wall not as a prison, nor as protection, but as a long act of listening. A listening made of stone, time and patience. Sometimes, on nights with a gentle breeze, I close my eyes and swear I can still hear the distant chants, the murmurs of the monks, the tap of chisel on granite. And then I remember the meaning isn't in finishing, it's in listening, in feeling, in knowing that even in the most repetitive of tasks, there is soul, there is memory, and there is beauty. And in that, my friend, lies a peace that even time cannot take away. The blacksmith's son has no lead. I remember clearly the morning breeze slipping through the cracks in our window, carrying the scent of damp earth and stale bread. It was the beginning of spring, but the days still held the lingering chill of the last frosts, the kind that made bones creak and fingers shrink. My father's workshop, though silent since his departure, still held the invisible warmth of the embers he used to rekindle before dawn. I was only 12 winters old, but that morning I wasn't awakened by dreams or sunlight in my eyes. I woke to the quiet sobs of my sister, seated on the floor with her broken sandals in her lap. She held the straps as if they were wilted flowers. The sandals were simple, cured leather, soles stitched by hand. But they were her only pair, and in those days, a pair of shoes meant more than protection. It meant being allowed at mass, in class, even in the queue for shared provisions. Mother was too busy trying to stretch food meant for 4 to feed 3, and we no longer asked neighbors for help. So I understood, right there, as the morning light barely touched the floor of the empty workshop, that if my sister appeared barefoot at Sunday Mass, the punishment would fall not just on her, but over all of us, like settling dust. I looked around my father's shop like one rummaging through a chest of memories. Every wooden bench, every hammer, every scrap of dry leather whispered his name. It was still early, and the sparrows sang as if nothing had changed. But his absence filled the room like cold smoke. The anvil, draped in heavy cloth, stood motionless, and the neatly organized jars of nails were beginning to gather dust. I knew I wasn't allowed to touch the main tools. Mother had made it clear the shop was to remain just as he had left it, at least for a while. But she hadn't stopped me from looking, and more importantly, from thinking. That's when I found, beside an old basket of scraps, a thick piece of dark leather cut into a crescent shape, likely a leftover from a harness strap, or perhaps an unfinished sandal. I also gathered a few rusty nails resting beside an oil-stained cloth. They weren't ideal, perhaps not even safe, but that morning they were more than mere objects. They were seeds of hope. I sat on the packed earth floor, my heart pounding, with my father's memory hovering like both shadow and guide. I didn't quite know what I was doing, but I knew why I was doing it. I cut the leather with a kitchen knife, already dull, which I had taken quietly from the stove. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of a task larger than myself. Shaping the leather to the worn sole, reinforcing the side straps, aligning holes with the tip of a nail heated over a candle. It all demanded more patience than skill, and I had little of either. But something silent guided me, as if each gesture awakened a memory. The way my father squinted as he lined up a seam, the soft thud of his hammer in the courtyard, the whistles that filled the quiet between one job and the next. My sister sat beside me without saying a word. Her eyes, still wet, followed my every movement as if witnessing a private mass, solemn, silent, built of faith and hesitation. When I lifted the sole to measure it against her small feet, I noticed they were cold. I grabbed one of the blankets from the bed and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Don't worry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I could keep that promise. It felt strange at that age to take on a role I hadn't chosen. But that's what grief does. It chisels childhood with the blade of necessity and makes us adults in silence. The leather creaked beneath my fingers as I pressed it into the old sole. I used the nails with great care, hammering them with a smooth stone I'd found near the well. Each strike seemed louder than the last, echoing through the calm morning as if the whole village might hear. Maybe they did hear, because one neighbor peeked through a gap in the gate. She didn't speak, only nodded, as if to say she understood without needing to ask. That gave me courage. Sometimes what strengthens us isn't direct help, but the quiet recognition of our effort. I spent nearly the whole morning on that task. I lost count of how many times I had to undo and restart, how many times my fingers got hurt or the sole slipped. But little by little, like stitching patience into the fabric of time, the sandal began to take shape. It wasn't perfect. It would never match those crafted by experienced hands. But it held another kind of beauty, more subtle and profound. The beauty of necessity, of quiet care, of effort made in love. When I finished, my sister took the pair with reverence, as if holding not sandals, but a shield against shame and punishment. She put them on gently, adjusting the improvised straps with small but determined fingers. She walked a few steps across the packed earth floor, testing her balance, the sound of the nails against the dry dirt, and then looked at me with a smile that was half gratitude, half surprise, as if she hadn't truly believed it would work. But it did. To the world's eyes, they may have looked patched and uneven, but for us, in that moment, they felt like sacred relics, made not with tools, but with what was left, a piece of leather, 2 handfuls of courage, and a love that didn't yet know its own name. The next morning, she went to Mass. I watched her walk down the stone road, holding her candle and stepping carefully with each footfall. The priest didn't notice the repairs, or if he did, he chose not to mention them. The other children said nothing, but one of the boys, the tanner's son, whispered something and pointed. My sister raised her chin proudly and walked on, as if her sandals were made of soft gold. Later that day, when she returned, she handed me a small barley biscuit wrapped in a handkerchief. "The lady from the garden gave me this," she said. "She said you're more of a blacksmith than you think." I kept that biscuit like a trophy. I didn't eat it that day, nor the next. I placed it inside a small wooden box where my father used to keep old soul patterns, as if preserving a medal, a quiet proof that even without anvil, fire, or instruction, something had been forged. That night, I told Mother what I had done. She looked at me for what felt like a long time, then ran her hand gently through my hair with a quiet tenderness, the kind that silently acknowledges a burden that arrived too soon. After that day, I began visiting the workshop more often. Not to truly work, I still wasn't allowed, but to sit on the same bench where my father used to sit, to observe the dust gathering on the jars, to listen to the echoes still floating between the wooden beams. Slowly, I began to recognize leather types by their scent, the thickness of nails by touch, the firmness of knots just by watching the old ones. It was as if the space itself was teaching me, as if the tools left behind still carried the warmth of his hands. And amidst it all, I learned to listen, not just to the sound of things, but to the silence between them. As the weeks went by, other small repairs began to appear. A neighbor's belt, a bucket strap, a loose tie on a cloth bag. Nothing official. No one called me a blacksmith, no one paid me in coins. But there was something subtle in these requests, as if they were testing what I could do, or perhaps helping me discover it for myself. Each task became a kind of conversation with my father, even without words. I remembered his gestures, the way he pressed his lips before hammering, the care he took with the final strap. And without noticing, I began to imitate him, not just in motion, but in patience and in silence. I remember an afternoon when Mother called me to the doorway with a piece of bread in her hands. She said the woman from the garden, the same one who had given my sister the biscuit, had left it as payment for a well-done stitch. It wasn't much, but it was more than enough. I ate that bread as if it were a feast, sharing half with my sister, who looked at me as if I had done something extraordinary. But all I had done was listen. Listen to the echoes of leather being shaped, the murmurs of memory, and the absence of my father filled in with small gestures. It was then I discovered that absence can teach as much as presence, sometimes even more. At the end of that month, Mother allowed me to clean the corners of the workshop. It was the first time since Father's death that someone entered that space with a purpose beyond remembrance. I wiped away the dust with damp cloths, reorganized the jars of nails and leathers, aligned the tools on their racks. While sweeping, I found a piece of forgotten lead inside a small wooden box, wrapped in an old cloth. It was dark, heavy, and cold to the touch, a concrete reminder of something I still didn't know how to do. I smiled, a mix of awe and reverence. "The blacksmith's son has no lead," I used to hear, but now I did. And more than that, I no longer needed it quite so much. I stored that piece away with care, but I never used it. Not for lack of opportunity, but by choice. Because what had shaped me until then hadn't been molten metal or perfect molds. It had been improvisation, affection, and the urgency of love. I began to notice that, even young, I had developed a new kind of gaze. The kind that sees when a lace comes loose, when a strap is about to tear, when someone needs help but doesn't know how to ask. And perhaps that's what my father saw in people when he repaired their sandals, their belts, their quiet hopes. The chance to ease the weight of a world that at times is far too heavy for those walking barefoot. That summer, as the feast of the patron saint approached, the whole village was buzzing with preparation. The bells rang earlier, colorful cloths appeared in windows, and the smell of sweet bread spread through the air like a promise of joy. That's when my sister came to me with a special request. She wanted to dance the first song of the evening, wearing the sandals I had mended. I hesitated. The leather was showing signs of wear, and the nails were beginning to loosen. But she insisted with that firm and tender look only younger siblings have when they still believe anything is possible. I spent the afternoon revisiting every seam, reinforcing the stitches with sack thread and placing 2 small pieces of leather under the heels for extra support. There were no good nails left, so I used tiny dried plum thorns that I had left in the sun to harden. "They won't last forever," I warned. She smiled and said, "They only need to last one dance." And they did. I watched my sister twirl across the torchlit square, her feet light, her dress spinning, her sandals strong. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't just inherited my father's craft. I had inherited his gesture of mending what the world tries to break in silence. After that night, something shifted in me, not like thunder, but like a candle quietly lit in the dark. I began to understand that there are labors not measured by effort, but by what they leave behind in others. The sandals I made wouldn't survive generations, wouldn't be displayed as works of skill, but they had carried my sister into a dance, and that was enough. I learned that often, the worth of something lies in the intention to make it last, even if only for one beautiful moment. And such moments, I discovered, are rare, and for that, all the more precious. Over time, the adults began to ask me for small repairs, with a mix of surprise and quiet respect. Some still whispered that I was too young to take on any trade, but there were also those who murmured, almost to themselves, that some boys are born with the soul of a man, not by choice, but by urgency. Mother remained steadfast, keeping the household with iron hands wrapped in tenderness, and my sister grew with the same gaze of the girl who once trusted a pair of crooked sandals. The workshop came alive again, but differently, not with thick smoke or loud hammering, but with presence, with listening, with stories sewn between one piece of leather and another. Sometimes I still dream of my father sitting at the bench, fingers steady on a strip of leather, eyes focused and kind. In the dream, he doesn't speak. He simply watches me work, with that half smile of someone who recognizes something familiar. I wake with the feeling of having received a wordless piece of advice, a lesson whispered through gestures. And it's curious how, even after all this time, the sound of his hammer still echoes more clearly in my memory than any bell in the village. It's a sound that calms, that anchors, as if saying that all things built with sincere intent remain, even after we're gone. Today, when I run my fingers along the worn wood of the anvil, I realize I didn't grow up to be a blacksmith. I became someone who learned to mend what matters. It's not always the leather, the metal, or the wood that needs repair. Sometimes it's the silences, the fragile ties, the small weights that others carry without knowing whom to ask for help. And every time I hear someone say, "The blacksmith's son has no lead," I smile inwardly. Because I know there are things heavier than lead, like absence, grief, and premature responsibility. But I also know there are things lighter, like forgiveness, the improvised gesture, and a mended sandal that survives the dance.